Welcome back to Media Law, where we're looking at Module 3A, Identifying Defamation, which is based around Chapter 7 of your textbook. Well, defamation is one of the key areas of media law. It's the one that most members of the public would associate with the topic of media law. And defamation is all to do with people's right to take action over material that might damage their reputation in the community. So defamation is all about often media material which damages somebody's reputation. Now this week we look at the basic ingredients of defamation and what constitutes the elements of a defamation action. Whereas next week we look at some of the key defences. Because the fact is that the media, the news media, are defaming people every day, but they do it with good reason. There is normally some defence that they're operating within, and it allows them to damage that person's reputation. The simplest example could be the media report about someone accused of rape and murder. Now, the media has a right to publish these allegations about that court case, even though their story is highly damaging to that individual. Their reputation is damaged because they're an accused rapist and murderer. But the media are operating under one of the defences that we learn about next week. So let's go to the basic definition and context of defamation. And the textbook gives you a range of definitions through history. The history is actually very important to defamation. It makes you understand better and to think more reflectively and mindfully about what you publish when you know a little bit about the history. You see, defamation originated in the ecclesiastical courts several centuries ago in England. And the action for defamation was to do with saying something that damaged somebody in their soul. The ecclesiastical courts were the church courts, and defamation was dealt with within the church courts because it was felt that it was essentially an offence against the individual's soul to be saying something nasty about them to other people. Now, we've all had nasty things said about us from time to time. I'm afraid I don't think there'd be anyone who has escaped that in their lives, and we know how it does hit us hard. We feel terrible within. And so you can see how, in a religious context, the church took control of that because they felt that this was damage to one's soul. Well, there's a bit of carryover of that today because if we think about defamation and us telling other people something negative about someone else that damages their reputation, then if it's bad enough, and particularly if there's no basis to it, then you think, well, that's a situation where they should have a right to take action over it. And that's why defamation sits as one of the areas of torts law, because it's known as a civil wrong. You can take action over defamation in the civil courts. You can sue somebody for an award of damages if they have damaged your reputation without defence, and the court agrees with your argument. So what's defamation based upon? Well, the judgments that you see there in the textbook talk about lowering someone's reputation in the eyes of other people, holding someone up to ridicule or contempt, publishing something which other people might shun or avoid someone over. But the main one, I think, is this lowering someone's reputation in the eyes of other people. And that links us into the key elements of defamation. To have defamation, you need what is called a defamatory imputation in what you've published. Now, it could be an image, it could be an actual word, it could be a series of words that give a certain impression, it could be some sound, it can be in any medium. But if what you have published or broadcast has an imputation, a defamatory meaning about it, then you've satisfied the first ingredient. And what's a defamatory meaning? It's a meaning which might lower the person's reputation. Clearly, if you say someone's a murderer or a rapist, you'll be damaging them in the eyes of other people. But it's not just really serious things like that. In academic circles, even as a student, it might be defamatory to say that someone has copied or plagiarized, because that's damaging their reputation amongst their peers. To say an accountant has been fraudulent. Now, it might, as I said, it might not be that word, fraudulent, but it might give that impression, give that what's called an innuendo through other things. Perhaps it's an accountant photographed with some criminal figures. Perhaps it's a document that someone's written that links the accountant to fraudulent practices. Well, next week we would look at the defence of truth to see whether there would be enough evidence to prove to the court that the imputation that you are defaming the person over is actually provable as true in court. So you need this defamatory sting. The other thing you need is reference to the plaintiff. And the plaintiff is the person who's bringing the action, the person who you have defamed. And really, the reference to them, it might actually name them. It might say that John Smith is a murderer, or it might not name them, but it might identify them closely enough for people who know them or work with them to identify it as them. It might say, for example, that a dentist from a particular suburb who loves to drive his red Porsche is suspected of malpractice in his dental practice. Well, if it is a particular dentist and you have a defence available, then perhaps you should have named that dentist if they'd appeared in court or one of the other defences applies. Because unbeknownst to you, there could be a second Porsche driving dentist who is totally innocent, whose reputation you have damaged. So you can get accidental defamation that way, but if you're responsible for the publication, you are responsible for the defamation and you could still face that lawsuit. Now, there are other aspects to identification that are discussed in the textbook, talking about how large the group might be before you could generally identify them like that. So, for example, if you said a Sydney dentist is suspected of malpractice, then there are so many dentists in Sydney that no one would reasonably think that it was this particular dentist. But the Porsche driving aspect of it narrows it down. So you might have 2 or 3, perhaps 10 other dentists suing you on that basis because people thought it was them. Now, for defamation, you also need to have published this material that damages the person's reputation. You must have at least published it to one other person. Reputation is to do with how other people think of you. And you can't damage someone's reputation if you just write to them directly. There could be some other law that you break, stalking laws or some kind of other law, breaking perhaps a court order where you're not supposed to be corresponding with someone. But you won't go for defamation, you won't be sued over defamation unless you have published to at least one other person. In social media or in mainstream media, we are normally doing that as a matter of course. So that criterion is then followed. So there are your main elements of defamation, and the textbook goes into much more detail with case examples under each of them. We also finally need to talk about the digital dimensions of defamation, and what we're finding now is many more cases, some of which I mentioned in the larger lecture and in the textbook, to do with social media. We have now had in Australia cases that are related to defamation on Twitter and Facebook, and some of these have been quite high-profile cases. The fact is that you can defame via any medium, and social media is no exception. Next week, we'll drill down into those defences, because the reality of defamation is not so much that you do sometimes defame someone in working as a journalist or even as a public relations practitioner. It's more whether you have that defence available. The law students should find this section particularly interesting, because many of you will need to advise people, advise clients, perhaps journalists, media companies, or other citizens using social media about what risk they have in their publications at risk of defamation. So go to your learning problem and start to examine that in terms of the criteria we've discussed. There's an area we haven't talked about in the mini lecture because it occurs so rarely, and that's the area of criminal defamation. And we can look at that more closely through your reading of the textbook and the other lecture. Don't forget to engage in all of the aspects of your study plan beyond this mini lecture, which you can see is quite short and conversational, just to help you get your head around the topic. We'll see you next time.